Cool. So I'm Patrick, as we said earlier. So what's been interesting, and this is something that happens a lot when we're speaking to potential customers or like existing customers, is people have this misconception that just because the API has been delivered, it's good at that point. And that's actually just the start of things. Because don't forget, like an API, as Mafan was saying, it's a direct pipe to a lot of data and information that's always changing. And the API might not always be delivering it correctly. And that's a critical need and something you need to be constantly tracking. So when we look at delivering an API, there's three key factors into what you're looking to achieve uh, from our perspective, from like testing and monitoring. And that's like you want to achieve quality, you want the thing to work, obviously. Security is actually a large issue, but it's a large issue because people aren't considering it the right way. So that so in reality, like 95% of like security issues is are actually human error or functional errors. Like when people talk about all these hacks and stuff, it sounds cool, but usually it's just something just poorly done and delivered that way. And I'll go through a few examples later. Then the last one is reliability. You want to make sure it's not only up, but up and working. And so internally we don't just say uptime, we say functional uptime. And that's like a large differentiator, and that's something that's evolving in the marketplace because people are realizing that just pinging an API is not doing enough. And so you'll even see like monitoring platforms are trying to add API testing, but they're calling it synthetic testing, and it's not nearly enough. While you should just be using your existing like API testing process as the monitoring. And so let me sort of go into that specifically a little bit more. So like, how do you achieve those three things? It's at the core of everything you do, functional testing and integration testing. So that's also like end-to-end testing. Those should be the core of your testing as part of your delivery, but also of your monitoring and your performance testing. So very specifically, like what you're building to use for functional testing should also be your monitor, not just run as part of like your execution. And that's an important differentiation that's not focused on enough at large enterprises, because large enterprises, you have a lot of silos. And what they might do is silo off monitoring to a different team. Well, I'm telling you, like that team is only doing ping tests or synthetic monitoring. They're not using what they should be doing. Like whoever's in charge of the API should also be in charge of the monitoring of it and the testing of it. So let me dive into a little bit of what is actually like a good functional test. And so what's important to note about APIs is that it's almost like a book. It's a lot of data delivered in a specific way, and you have to proofread that book. So it's you not only just checking that the status code is 200, you want to make sure that every single object is there as expected, and it's the business logic of it. So one step further than just making sure like a number is there when it should be there, whether it's a float or a whole number or whatever. Beyond just that, what if it's like the price of something? So example I like to use is when you're talking about like sizes. So when you if you're a large e-commerce company and you do a search and you just do a search and like you might have a bunch of different types of objects that all have sizes. So like shoes versus pants, but the range of sizes is different. So your test should be smart enough to differentiate. If it's a pair of shoes, the sizes are 2 to 12. If it's a pair of pants, it's 28 to 48 or whatever it might be. Like that differentiation is a level worth putting on your API test because that also captures a lot of other stuff. So let me give you one example of a customer we had. They were a large book publisher. And so what was interesting about them is that they already had internal monitoring, they thought. And so then they brought us in. And so what we did is they had two partner APIs. One of them gave you a list of all the products. The other API allowed you to dive into each of those products individually. Well, what we did is we created a monitor that tests both of those together. So first we get the API with all the list of products, the ISBNs. We got that list, then use that as the data to feed our next call. And so what that was doing is then we get a result of like 1,000 products. We took 200 of them randomly, dove into each one of those individually. And what we were finding was that every 2 weeks on a Monday morning for about 3 hours, there are hundreds of errors. Long story short, what we found out was that they refreshed their database every Monday in the morning. The problem was they were using their API manager and caching the endpoint, which is a good idea for performance reasons. So their product listing was cached and it had old data for 2 hours every morning. And they were getting complaints from their partners saying like something wasn't working right yesterday, but they didn't actually have the information. So like the partners didn't know what was happening fully, and the book publisher had no idea what was happening. And we caught that because what we did is again, we put the functional and integration test as the core of monitoring. So they're also using those tests automatically as part of the deployments as well. So it's one suite of tests used for everything, even performance testing. So they've brought it all across. Like they started using us simply because they want to do double checking their SLAs on their partner API. Then they realized like these exact same things should be used as part of the delivery process. So if we sort of like dive into it a little bit more, like, so if we were to take an e-commerce store, for example, first thing you do is you create a functional test. So let's say, again, an e-commerce store, you do a search for like the color red, and you get all of these products, and they're different types of products. You create a test that validates all of these, including the business logic that I was telling you about like the size differences, and like, maybe quantity should be greater than 0 because you don't want to list products are out of stock if that's a rule within the company. So those sorts of things count as your functional test. And then the next step is you use that functional test, and you'll make another call that might dive into those products individually. Put those together, and that's one test. So don't just be hitting one endpoint at a time. You should be using APIs as the source of your data. Because the things we're seeing today are people are still sort of committing themselves to using a bit of an antiquated theory of testing, whereby they're using like CSVs. So we have the CSV of 40 things, and we just run it that way. We actually had a customer we were talking to. What they were doing was they would make this 10 same API calls on production that they would do on staging, and if they got the same results, they would push that version live. Like that's what they were calling API testing. And that's the sort of thing where you don't catch what I was talking about earlier with the book publisher, whereby they had complete outages for multiple hours a day on their partner API, which was pivotal to their business because they had completely shifted to like online. They had gotten rid of their stores. And so it's a really critical thing to consider of connecting those things. So like, search, add to cart, and checkout. That is a consumer flow. That's like your average, for Macy's or something, that's how they work. Why isn't that one test? You should be writing tests that reproduce your most common user flows, and then write more tests going for the edge cases as well. But like the core of it has to be the entire reproduction of what an API consumer uses in one test. And then the key to all of this is that's really smart test you've created. You'll have hundreds of them. Use that, not just for your delivery and as part of your CI, delivering and automating the testing. That should be your monitor as well. Like don't rely on the monitoring team because they're not incapable, they're not trained to know what the API should be doing at the fundamental level that people on this call are. If you're using WS02 or you're interested in WS02, you're an API builder. You're the only one that really knows how it should be delivered, and it should be at the core of performance testing, functional testing, and monitoring. It should be at the core of all those three things. Those same tests should power all of that. You shouldn't have that differentiated because then you're losing that knowledge, that domain knowledge when you're trying to say like, well, I'm going to do load testing in JMeter, but then I'll use something totally different to do functional testing, and then the monitoring will use Datadog. Those are three completely different systems, and only one is hopefully doing something well, but it's not being used for the monitoring. It's probably not being used for the performance testing. Like you should be performance testing entire user flows, not just pinging an API a bunch of times hoping to catch a memory leak. The really important aspect to all of this is, the thing that really scares people is security, like vulnerabilities. And so like on our blog, we go into detail about these 3 hacks, but they're not hacks at all. Like these are 3 huge vulnerabilities that was just error. So Twitter created an API that had no throttling. So that allowed people to find private information on thousands of people. It was actually another country. It was a country in Asia somewhere. We're just finding people's personal emails. India accidentally put an API live, public, that shouldn't have been live, and it had no throttling, so everyone could keep hitting it. And then the United States Postal Service allowed you to search by wildcard. So instead of just getting your information, you're able to get everyone's information because a wildcard is sort of the everything. So like they didn't have tests. They weren't testing throttling. They weren't testing wildcards. Like these are just basic tests that should be delivered, not just as part of the delivery, but don't forget, you should be using that same stuff as your monitor. Because as we saw with like the book publisher, we caught that not as part of the delivery, but as part of the monitor, because the data is different in the public domain. Like your production data is different, and that could be at the core of what's causing the issue. So again, just to summarize, like one set of tests used for everything and then used across the organization. Like one big issue we see today is that people are sort of siloing. One team of 5 has one tester with them, and they'll build an API, and then they'll have one tester testing it in his own method or her own method, while then the other team, she's doing something totally different to test it. Well, then as an organization top down, how do you know if the whole thing is working? Don't forget, like when you're creating these tests and reproducing user flows, you shouldn't, like, a lot of times people say like, well, the developer should write a test. Well, they're going to write the test for their endpoint, but what about all the endpoints connected? That goes across a bunch of different teams. Like as I was saying, reproducing consumer flow. That's why you need like an actual real QA, someone that'll commit themselves to building a test that goes through search, add to cart, checkout, for example. Goes through all of that, builds one super test for that, and then uses it for performance monitoring and as part of automation.